September 8th, 1944, a forest clearing in the Netherlands, 15 kilometres east of The Hague. A German sergeant named Wilhelm Braun watches as his crew raises a 14-ton metal cylinder toward the grey autumn sky. The rocket stands nearly 14 metres tall, painted in a camouflage pattern that seems almost absurd given its size. Braun has been with Artillery Abteilung 485 since the beginning of operations, and he has learned to hate this machine with every fibre of his being. The fueling process begins. Liquid oxygen, chilled to minus 183 degrees Celsius, flows into the oxidizer tank. The cold is so intense that frost forms instantly on the metal surface, and any man foolish enough to touch it loses his skin. 4,910 kilograms of this cryogenic nightmare. Then comes the ethanol, 3,810 kilograms of it, enough to make the entire launch site smell like a distillery. The hydrogen peroxide, the sodium permanganate, each substance capable of killing every man present if something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong. Braun's unit has lost 3 men this month alone, not to Allied fighters, not to partisan attacks, to the weapon itself. He thinks of the propaganda broadcasts he heard before transferring to this unit. The Vergeltungswaffe, the vengeance weapon that would bring England to its knees, the miracle that would turn the tide of the war. Standing here, watching his men risk their lives to fire a weapon that might explode on the launch pad, might disintegrate in mid-air, might land harmlessly in a field 17 kilometres from its target, Braun understands what the propagandists will never admit. This wonder weapon is a wonder only in how completely it wastes German lives and resources, and Braun is far from alone in this assessment. The problem facing German leadership in 1942 was simple to state and impossible to solve. Allied bombers were destroying German cities with impunity. The Luftwaffe could not stop them. Anti-aircraft guns could not stop them. Something new was needed. Something that could strike back at Britain without risking pilots or aircraft. Something that could operate from mobile positions, invisible to Allied reconnaissance, invulnerable to interception. The solution had been in development since the 1930s. Werner von Braun and his team at Peenemünde had created the A4 rocket, a technological marvel that could carry a 1,000 kilogram warhead over 300 kilometers at speeds exceeding 5,000 kilometers per hour, faster than sound, faster than any aircraft, faster than any warning system could detect. The weapon arrived before the sound of its approach. Victims heard the explosion, then the screaming whistle of the rocket descending, then silence. The sequence was inverted. Death came first. Josef Goebbels personally renamed it the V2, the second Vergeltungswaffe, the second vengeance weapon. He promised the German people that this miracle would exact revenge for the devastation of Hamburg and Cologne and Berlin. He promised that England would burn. He promised that the war would turn. The German people believed him. They had no choice but to believe. What Goebbels did not mention was the cost. Each V2 required materials that could have built a high-performance fighter aircraft. Each launch consumed 30 tons of potatoes worth of ethanol, 1/3 of Germany's entire fuel alcohol production going into rockets that mostly failed to reach their targets. Each operational unit required over 5,000 personnel and 1,500 vehicles, an enormous logistics footprint for delivering a single ton of explosives. The mathematics made no military sense, but this was not about mathematics, this was about vengeance. This was about the psychological comfort of striking back, even if the strikes accomplished nothing. The men who actually operated these weapons understood the reality that propaganda concealed. They called it das Gerät, the device, clinical terminology for a clinical nightmare. No romance, no glory. Just the endless, terrifying process of preparing a weapon that seemed designed to kill its own operators. The technical specifications reveal why German crews dreaded every launch. The V2 used a propulsion system of breathtaking complexity and danger. The main engine burned ethanol and liquid oxygen at temperatures reaching 2,820 degrees Celsius. The turbopump operated on hydrogen, peroxide, and sodium permanganate, chemicals that exploded violently when contaminated. The guidance system relied on gyroscopes and an integrating accelerometer, primitive computers that frequently malfunctioned. The airframe was constructed from steel that often failed during the stresses of atmospheric re-entry. Consider the numbers that defined a launch crew's existence. Each rocket required 90 minutes minimum to prepare, 90 minutes of exposure to Allied aircraft while clustered around tanker vehicles filled with explosive propellants. 39 specialized personnel handled fire control, surveying, engine systems, electrical systems, and vehicle operations. A full operational Gruppe required 5,306 men and 1,592 vehicles. All of this to deliver 1,000 kilograms of Amatol explosive to a target that the weapon would probably miss by several kilometers. The failure rates were catastrophic. During early testing at Blizna in Poland, only 4 of 26 launches successfully reached the target area. 15% success. The remaining 85% either exploded on the pad, disintegrated during ascent, broke apart during re-entry, or landed so far from their targets that they accomplished nothing. Even after months of refinement, operational rockets failed at rates that would have ended any other weapons program. 12% of all rockets were ejected on-site by launch units before firing, 10% failed visibly at launch, 25% exploded in mid-air before reaching their targets. 12% landed in the sea or in areas so remote that their impact was never recorded. When these figures are combined, roughly 1/3 of all V2s never completed their mission. And the rockets that did arrive carried a circular error probability of 12 kilometres. Half of all rockets that survived to impact fell more than 12 kilometres from their aim point. This was not a precision weapon. This was barely a weapon at all. The personal accounts from launch crews paint a picture of constant terror. On September 6th, 1944, the first operational day, Battery 444, attempted to launch 2 rockets against Paris from Sterpigny in Belgium. Rocket number 18589 reached full power, lifted a few feet from the launch table, then settled back down when the engine cut unexpectedly. The crew scattered, expecting detonation. The rocket sat there, fully fueled, for hours while specialists debated how to approach it. That same day, rocket number 18593 suffered an identical failure. That same day, partisans attacked Battery 444, causing the unit's first combat casualties. The Wonder Weapon program had begun exactly as it would continue, with failure and death and nothing to show for either. The disasters accumulated with grim regularity. On September 30th, a V2 crashed on the launch pad at Ridge-Sterbosch in the Netherlands and detonated with full force. The explosion destroyed the launch site and the surrounding trees, creating a crater 13 meters wide and 6 meters deep. German troop casualties were documented, but the numbers were suppressed. On October 5th, rocket number 19031 became what crews called a short shot, impacting only 5 kilometers from launch, killing 1 German civilian woman and injuring 2 others. The weapon meant to devastate Britain was killing Germans instead. On October 9th at Rimlingen, rocket number 18401 exploded on the launch table, injuring 2 soldiers. The pattern was established. Every launch carried the possibility of death for the men conducting it. The fuel handling procedures were nightmares in themselves. Liquid oxygen at minus 183 degrees Celsius caused instant frostbite on contact. Men lost fingers, men lost hands. The ethanol was flammable enough to turn the entire launch site into an inferno if ignited. The hydrogen peroxide residue coated components that crews had to handle manually, burning skin on contact. One incident on September 14th documented 2 police officers suffering severe burns simply from touching equipment that had been used in a previous launch. The men operating Germany's Wonder Weapon were being maimed by it before it ever reached the enemy. If you are finding this exploration of the V2's hidden history valuable, consider subscribing to the channel. It takes only a moment and helps these in-depth investigations reach a wider audience. Now, let us examine what may be the darkest chapter of this entire program, one that the launch crews knew about even as they pretended not to. The statistic is verified by the Smithsonian Institution, the Imperial War Museum, and every serious historian who has examined the evidence. More people died building the V2 than were ever killed by V2 attacks. This is not speculation, this is documented fact. Approximately 20,000 to 25,000 concentration camp prisoners died in the Mittelbau-Dora camp system. V2 attacks killed roughly 9,000 civilians and military personnel combined. The weapon murdered more of its makers than its victims. Mittelbau-Dora was established on August 28, 1943, after the Royal Air Force raid on Peenemünde forced V2 production underground. Hitler ordered Heinrich Himmler to use concentration camp labour to carve tunnels through Kornstein Mountain near Nordhausen. Approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through the camp system over its operational life. 1 in 3 died. The initial conditions from August 1943 to spring 1944 were apocalyptic in their horror. Prisoners lived in what were called sleeping tunnels, Schlafstollen, with 4-level bunk beds crammed into spaces without daylight or fresh air. Barrels cut in half served as latrines. 14-hour workdays continued amid continuous blasting that filled living areas with toxic dust. The prisoners breathed rock dust. They breathed explosive residue. They breathed the stench of death from bodies that accumulated faster than they could be removed. By late 1943, Mittelbau-Dora had the highest death rate in the entire concentration camp system. In January 1944 alone, 669 registered deaths occurred, up from just 5 in September 1943. When Albert Speer and his staff visited the tunnels in December 1943, they found conditions littered with corpses. Some of Speer's staff members required additional leave to recover from shock at what they witnessed. Yet Speer himself wrote to SS officer Hans Kammler congratulating him on transforming the underground installation into a factory which has no equal in Europe. The compliment was technically accurate. No other factory in Europe had achieved such productivity through such systematic murder. The German launch crews knew where their rockets came from. They knew about Dora. They may not have known every detail, but the rumours circulated. The rockets arrived bearing the marks of their creation. small defects and imperfections that suggested the hands that built them had been weak from starvation, shaking from exhaustion, perhaps deliberately imprecise in small acts of sabotage. Over 200 prisoners were publicly hanged for alleged sabotage, often with little evidence. The rockets were unreliable regardless. They had been unreliable from the beginning. Slave labour may have contributed to some failures, but the fundamental engineering problems existed independent of who assembled the components. The men who launched V2s carried this knowledge with them. They were complicit in a system that murdered more people than their weapon ever would. Some cared, some did not. But all of them knew, on some level, that the wonder weapon they served was built on a foundation of bones. The scale of resources consumed by the V2 program defies rational military analysis. The program cost approximately $2 billion in 1944 currency, equivalent to the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bombs, which actually ended the war. Each individual rocket cost as much as a high-performance fighter aircraft. Germany produced over 6,000 V2s. That represents over 6,000 fighter aircraft that were never built, over 6,000 pilots who might have defended German cities, over 6,000 opportunities to contest Allied air superiority that were instead launched into the sky to explode harmlessly in empty fields or kill a handful of civilians whose deaths changed nothing about the war's outcome. The program consumed 1/3 of Germany's entire fuel alcohol production. 30 tons of potatoes were required to produce ethanol for a single launch. In a nation facing food shortages, strategic resources were being converted into rocket fuel to power weapons that mostly failed. The labour allocation was equally absurd. 60,000 workers passed through Mittelbau-Dora. Thousands of engineers and technicians worked at Peenemünde and related facilities. Support personnel numbered in the tens of thousands. The logistics chain stretched across occupied Europe. All of this to deliver roughly 3,200 successful strikes that killed approximately 9,000 people over 7 months of operations. For comparison, Allied bombers killed approximately 50,000 people in the Hamburg firestorm raids of July 1943. That was accomplished in a few nights, not 7 months. That used conventional aircraft that returned to base and flew again. That represented a tiny fraction of Allied bombing capacity. The V2 program consumed resources equivalent to a significant portion of Germany's remaining industrial capacity and achieved less than a single Allied bombing campaign. Physicist Freeman Dyson, who worked operations research for RAF Bomber Command during the war, delivered the most damning Allied assessment. He wrote that the Allies knew each V2 cost as much to produce as a high-performance fighter airplane. They knew that German forces on the fighting fronts were in desperate need of airplanes. They knew that the V2 rockets were doing them no military damage. From their point of view, the V2 program was almost as good as if Hitler had adopted a policy of unilateral disarmament. The alternative uses for these resources haunt military historians. The Wasserfall surface-to-air missile required only 500 man-hours to build, versus the V2's 7,500. Albert Speer later wrote that substantial deployment of Wasserfall from the spring of 1944 onward, together with an uncompromising use of jet fighters as air defense interceptors, would have essentially stalled the Allied strategic bombing offensive against German industry. Instead, those resources built rockets that could not be aimed, could not be defended against interception because they did not need to be, and killed fewer people than the system required to manufacture them. Hitler himself was initially unimpressed with the weapon. He called the V2 merely an artillery shell with a longer range and much higher cost. When told the warhead could not be increased beyond 1 ton, Hitler reportedly cried that what he wanted was annihilation, annihilating effect. General Walter Dornberger, the Wehrmacht head of the program, had to explain that V2s could only create pinpricks, not strategic damage. The program proceeded anyway. Vengeance demanded it. The V2 possessed exactly one military advantage, and it was purely psychological. The weapon travelled faster than sound. It arrived without warning. Victims heard the sonic boom only after the explosion had already occurred. First came a whip-cracking sound as the blast wave bounced off the point of impact. Then came the chaos of the explosion with debris and earth churned skyward. Then came the whine and rush of whistling air as sound caught up with the rocket, followed by a deafening roar. Then, silence. The sequence was inverted. The warning came after the death. There could be no sirens, there could be no shelter, there could be no defense. The deadliest single V2 strike occurred on December 16th, 1944 at the Rex Cinema in Antwerp. Approximately 1,100 people were watching Gary Cooper in the Plainsman when a rocket launched by SS Werfer Battery 500 from Hellendoorn in the Netherlands pierced the roof at 3 times the speed of sound. 567 people died in an instant. 296 Allied servicemen, up to 74 Belgian children. A massive steam boiler explosion added to the carnage, scalding trapped survivors and rescuers who arrived to help. Recovery operations continued for nearly a week. Afterward, Antwerp authorities shut all theatres and banned gatherings exceeding 50 people. Time magazine labelled Antwerp the city of sudden death. Charles Austin, an eyewitness, later recalled that he had walked past the theatre about 20 minutes before the impact. He realised that at that very moment, a V2 was being fuelled by members of SS Werfer Battery 500 in Holland, destined to kill all those people in one blinding instant. The random cruelty of it overwhelmed him. 20 minutes earlier, and he would have been inside. The rocket did not care. The rocket could not care. It went where physics sent it, and physics sent it into a crowded cinema on a winter afternoon. Britain's worst V2 strike hit Woolworths in New Cross on November 25th, 1944, during busy Saturday shopping. 168 people died, including 33 children and babies in prams. Don Skelton barely escaped. His mother and he were in Woolworths shopping when she saw a broccoli tram outside and they ran out and jumped on. The rocket struck about 5 minutes after they left. 5 minutes separated life from obliteration. The randomness of survival left psychological scars that never healed. The final V2 to cause fatalities in Britain struck Hughes Mansions in Whitechapel on March 27th, 1945, just 3 weeks before VE Day. 134 people died, including 120 Jewish residents who had survived years of war only to perish in its final days. Over 30 children were getting ready for school when the rocket arrived. Mrs. Halpern, who lost her mother in the attack, later testified that the impact never left her no matter what age she was. She lost her mother, she lost her home, she was left penniless. The Wonder Weapon's final British victims were elderly Jews and schoolchildren. This was the vengeance that Goebbels promised. The gap between propaganda and reality was something German crews witnessed firsthand. Goebbels had personally renamed the technical A4 rocket Vergeltungswaffe II as a propaganda term. From 1943, he stoked promises of coming Wunderwaffen that would turn the tide and exact vengeance for Allied bombing of German cities. On June 18th, 1943, speaking to 20,000 people in Dortmund's Westfalenhalle, Goebbels promised a coming Vergeltungswunder, a vengeance miracle. The crowd believed him because they wanted to believe. The men who actually launched these weapons used different terminology. They called it das Gerät, the device. The clinical name suggested distance from the grandiose promises. General Dornberger himself was recorded at a British prisoner camp after the war, stating that he had begged the Führer to stop the V-weapon propaganda because nothing more could be expected from 1 ton of explosive. The men who built and launched the rockets knew their limitations. The propaganda machine did not care about limitations. Even Goebbels eventually recognized the credibility problem he had created. The Smithsonian records that Goebbels held off announcing the V2 for 2 months because the ministry's exaggerated V1 propaganda had led to disillusionment inside the Reich. Germans had been promised miracles. Germans had received explosions in distant English cities that did nothing to stop the bombers overhead. The V2 would be different, Goebbels insisted. It would be unstoppable. He was technically correct. The V2 was unstoppable because nothing could intercept a weapon moving faster than sound. But unstoppable did not mean effective. Unstoppable did not mean accurate. Unstoppable did not mean that 1,000 kilograms of explosive delivered randomly somewhere within a 12-kilometer radius would change the outcome of a war that Germany was already losing. Werner von Braun's private attitude differed sharply from his public statements. In March 1944, he was arrested by the Gestapo for drunk remarks that Germany was likely to lose the war, and his main task was building a spaceship. He did not care about vengeance. He did not care about the war. He cared about reaching the stars, and the V2 was his vehicle for doing so. Fellow engineer Peter Wegener observed that von Braun joked in small groups about meetings with government leaders. It became obvious that he disliked Hitler and all that Hitler did. Von Braun himself later admitted that they felt no moral scruples about the possible future use of their brainchild. They were interested solely in exploring space. It was simply a question with them of how the golden cow could be milked most successfully. The golden cow was milked with the blood of 20,000 slaves, and the futile deaths of 9,000 civilians. The golden cow consumed resources that might have prolonged German resistance. The golden cow produced a weapon that killed more of its makers than its targets, and the men who fired it, the sergeants and technicians and officers of Artillerieabteilung 485 and 836, and the SS-Werfer units, those men knew exactly what they were operating. Not a wonder weapon, not a miracle. An expensive, unreliable, morally compromised failure that existed because propaganda demanded vengeance, even when vengeance accomplished nothing. September 8th, 1944, a forest clearing in the Netherlands. Wilhelm Braun watches the rocket rise into the grey sky, trailing fire, climbing faster than sound, disappearing into the clouds. He does not know where it will land. He does not know if it will reach its target. He does not know if the next launch will explode on the pad and kill him and his crew. He knows only that tomorrow he will do this again, and the day after, and the day after that, until the war ends, or until the weapon he hates finally kills him. The V2 does not care about Wilhelm Braun's hatred. The V2 does not care about the slaves who built it, or the civilians it will kill, or the resources it wastes. The V2 is just metal and fuel and explosives, a 14-meter monument to the gap between what propaganda promises and what reality delivers. Germany's wonder weapon. The nightmare of the men who fired it, the terror of those it struck, the graveyard of those who built it, the greatest strategic blunder of a regime defined by strategic blunders. In April 1945, American forces captured the Mittelbau-Dora complex. They found the rockets, they found the production facilities, they found the mass graves. They took the scientists, including von Braun, and brought them to America to build the rockets that would eventually reach the moon. The V2's legacy lives on in every rocket that has launched since. Every satellite, every spacecraft, every ballistic missile pointed at cities that have never heard of Peenemünde or Dora, or the forest clearings of Holland, where German sergeants learned to hate the wonder weapon they served. The propaganda called it vengeance, the crews called it das Gerät, history calls it what it was. A technological triumph that was simultaneously a military catastrophe, a moral crime, and a monument to the human capacity for self-deception. The wonder weapon that was hated by the men who fired it, feared by the civilians it struck, and mourned by the slaves who died building it. The V2, the weapon that killed more of its makers than its enemies. The weapon that consumed the resources of an empire to accomplish almost nothing. The weapon that stands, even now, as a warning about what happens when vengeance matters more than victory.